Just finally on the Bible, it also talks about things like angels and demons and stuff like that, which people point to as well. Obviously, that can't be true. I mean, what do you say to people when they raise things like angels and demons?
Well, I mean, it's starting with the assumption that the supernatural doesn't exist. And I simply, I don't think that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of things that, from, say, a secular materialistic perspective, are far more of needing an explanation than the existence of supernatural beings. I mean, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK, who runs an organization called Speak Life, he talks about this a lot, where, there are things that atheists and secular materialists have to account for, things like everything coming from nothing, order coming from chaos, life emerging from non-life, minds that, from mindless matter. Is it more of a leap in logic to believe in angels and demons, or that everything came from nothing, Pierce? That order came from chaos, that life emerged from non-life, and
Mm.
that mind form from mindless matter? I would say these are answers that, arguably, in terms of the topic of what we're, on the eve of Easter, the resurrection is not one more absurdity. Neither are angels or demons, but the resurrection, I think, actually is the explanation that makes sense of the supernatural world that we see talked about in, all sorts of religious perspectives. And I think that people will assume that the supernatural can't exist, and yet at the exact same time, they will, as a conscious human being in a world where we're still not really entirely sure what consciousness is, try to explain
Mm.
logically some of these things when, the rules of logic exist objectively, and yet they are outside of time and matter and space. And so there are obviously things that things like science and secular materialism can't account for. And I have no qualms saying that supernatural beings exist in light of this very strange supernatural world that we live in.
You know what? I completely agree. And it comes back to what I started this interview with, which was when I debate with atheists and so on who mock me for having any kind of faith in God or whatever. I say, well, look, you cannot explain to me what was there before your Big Bang. You cannot explain what was there when it was nothing. You can't even explain what nothing is. So, because the human brain cannot understand that, as I said at the start, then to me, there must be super beings, entities out there. And all right, I've chosen, because I was raised as a Catholic, I've chosen to take a certain path of my belief and faith system and so on. But actually, the idea that there can't be anything supernatural when a human brain cannot explain basic things like what was there before your Big Bang or whatever, that to me is the evidence I need. Of course, there must be stuff that is more powerful than humans, because otherwise we would be able to explain all that stuff, and we can't.
I think that's exactly right, Pearson. And Joe and I talked about that on my episode on the JRE, in that
Mm,
some people believe in the virgin birth and others believe in the virgin birth of the universe. And so a big bang
mm.
requires a big banger. And so I think it's not entirely
Yeah.
a leap to find an explanation for that, right? Something like survival of the fittest doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. There are still explanations
Right.
for origin questions that I think, we can ascribe it to, like Lawrence Krauss wants to do, nothing. But then he has to define nothing, and you find out he actually doesn't think nothing means no thing. He actually thinks it means something.
Mm.
And so that's exactly right. I think, when we're talking about everything coming from nothing, well, finely tuned explosion, that order from chaos, then I think actually when we're looking for the answers to these questions, it was once said, I can't remember exactly who, that the scientists and the philosophers have been climbing the mountains only to find the theologians at the top all the way along.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing about atheists is they must die so unhappy because that's it. Whereas you and I, it's just the beginning.
Well, I would want to instill hope in those atheists and say, you may think this is all there is, but it's not. And, there is
Yeah.
so much more than just this. And to really push into some of those more metaphysical, existential questions. How does everything come from nothing? How does order come from chaos? How does life emerge from non-life? How do minds come from mindless matter? And I would really encourage them to say and look into something like the Bible, which I think ultimately gives answers.
Well, I can't wait to meet Richard Dawkins and Ricky Gervais on the other side, just to see their faces and say, "Yeah, see, I told you."
Well, between you and me, I hope that they come to a place where on the other side, they're going to be in the same place where I am. And that the told you so is grasping it and unity rather than them maybe going some different direction. So I continue to pray for Ricky Gervais and Richard Dawkins and have hope that if Jesus can change Paul from being a persecutor of the church, Richard Dawkins is far outside of the realm of possibility of salvation.